Resist not evil. Leo Tolstoy's My Religion. Chapters 4 and 5. I now understood the words of Jesus. Ye have heard that it hath been said, An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil. Jesus' meaning is, you have thought that you are acting in a reasonable manner in defending yourself by violence against evil, in tearing out an eye for an eye, by fighting against evil with criminal tribunals, guardians of the peace, armies. But I say unto you, renounce violence. Have nothing to do with violence. Do harm to no one, not even to your enemy. I understood now that in saying resist not evil, Jesus not only told us what would result from the observance of this rule, but established a new basis for society conformable to his doctrine and opposed to the social basis established by the law of Moses, by Roman law, and by the different codes in force today. He formulated a new law whose effect would be to deliver humanity from its self-inflicted woes. His declaration was, you believe that your laws reform criminals. As a matter of fact, they only make more criminals. There is only one way to suppress evil, and that is to return good for evil without respect of persons. For thousands of years, you have tried the other method. Now try mine. Try the reverse. Strange to say, in these later days, I talked with different persons about this commandment of Jesus. Resist not evil, and rarely found anyone to coincide with my opinion. Two classes of men would never, even by implication, admit the literal interpretation of the law. These men were at the extreme poles of the social scale. They were the conservative Christian patriots who maintained the infallibility of the Church and the atheistic revolutionists. Neither of these two classes was willing to renounce the right to resist by violence what they regarded as evil, and the wisest and most intelligent among them would not acknowledge the simple and evident truth that if we once admit the right of any man to resist by violence what he regards as evil, every other man has equally the right to resist by violence what he regards as evil. Not long ago, I had in my hands an interesting correspondence between an Orthodox Slavophile and a Christian revolutionist. The one advocated violence as a partisan of a war for the relief of brother Slavs in bondage, the other as a partisan of revolution in the name of our brothers, the oppressed Russian peasantry. Both invoked violence, and each based himself upon the doctrine of Jesus. The doctrine of Jesus is understood in 100 different ways, but never, unhappily, in the simple and direct way which harmonizes with the inevitable meaning of Jesus' words. Our entire social fabric is founded upon principles that Jesus reproved. We do not wish to understand his doctrine in its simple and direct acceptation, and yet we assure ourselves and others that we follow his doctrine, or else that his doctrine is not expedient for us. Believers profess that Christ as God, the second person of the Trinity, descended upon earth to teach men by his example how to live. They go through the most elaborate ceremonies for the consummation of the sacraments, the building of temples, the sending out of missionaries, the establishment of priesthoods, for parochial administration, for the performance of rituals. But they forget one little detail, the practice of the commandments of Jesus. Unbelievers endeavor in every possible way to organize their existence independent of the doctrine of Jesus, they having decided a priori that this doctrine is of no account. But to endeavor to put his teachings in practice, this each refuses to do, and the worst of it is that without any attempt to put them in practice, both believers and unbelievers decide a priori that it is impossible. Jesus said simply and clearly that the law of resistance to evil by violence, which has been made the basis of society, is false and contrary to man's nature. And he gave another basis, that of non-resistance to evil, a law which, according to his doctrine, would deliver man from wrong. You believe, he says in substance, that your laws, which resort to violence, correct evil. Not at all. They only augment it. For thousands of years you have tried to destroy evil by evil, and you have not destroyed it. You have only augmented it. Do as I command you, follow my example, and you will know that my doctrine is true. Not only in words, but by his acts, by his death, did Jesus propound his doctrine, resist not evil. Believers listen to all this. They hear it in their churches, persuaded that the words are divine. They worship Jesus as God, and then they say, all this is admirable, but it is impossible. As society is now organized, it would derange our whole existence, and we should be obliged to give up the customs that are so dear to us. We believe it all, but only in this sense, that it is the ideal toward which humanity ought to move, the ideal which is to be attained by prayer and by believing in the sacraments, in the redemption, and in the resurrection of the dead. The others, the unbelievers, the freethinkers who comment on the doctrine of Jesus, the historians of religions, the Strausses, the Reynolds, completely imbued with the teachings of the Church, which says that the doctrine of Jesus accords with difficulty with our conceptions of life, tell us very seriously that the doctrine of Jesus is the doctrine of a visionary, the consolation of feeble minds, that it was all very well preached in the fishermen's huts by Galilee, but that for us it is only the sweet dream of one whom Renan calls the charmant docteur. In their opinion, Jesus could not rise to the heights of wisdom and culture attained by our civilization. If he had been on an intellectual level with his modern critics, he never would have uttered his charming nonsense about the birds of the air, the turning of the other cheek, the taking no thought for the morrow. These historical critics judge of the value of Christianity by what they see of it as it now exists. The Christianity of our age and civilization approves of society as it now is, with its prison cells, its factories, its houses of infamy, its parliaments. But as for the doctrine of Jesus, which is opposed to modern society, it is only empty words. The historical critics see this, and unlike the so-called believers, having no motives for concealment, submit the doctrine to a careful analysis. They refute it systematically and prove that Christianity is made up of nothing but chimerical ideas. It would seem that before deciding upon the doctrine of Jesus, it would be necessary to understand of what it consisted, and to decide whether his doctrine is reasonable or not, it would be well first to realize that he said exactly what he did say. And this is precisely what we do not do, what the church commentators do not do, what the freethinkers do not do, and we know very well why. We know perfectly well that the doctrine of Jesus is directed at and denounces all human errors, all tohu, all the empty idols that we try to accept from the category of errors by dubbing them church, state, culture, science, art, civilization. But Jesus spoke precisely of all these, of these and all other tohu. Not only Jesus, but all the Hebrew prophets, John the Baptist, all the true sages of the world denounced the church and state and culture and civilization of their times as sources of man's perdition. Imagine an architect who says to a house owner, "Your house is good for nothing. You must rebuild it," and then describes how the supports are to be cut and fastened. The proprietor turns a deaf ear to the words, "Your house is good for nothing," and only listens respectfully when the architect begins to discuss the arrangement of the rooms. Evidently, in this case, all the subsequent advice of the architect will seem to be impracticable. Less respectful proprietors would regard it as nonsensical. But it is precisely in this way that we treat the doctrine of Jesus. I give this illustration for want of a better. I remember now that Jesus, in teaching his doctrine, made use of the same comparison. "Destroy this temple," he said, "and in 3 days I will raise it up." It was for this they put him on the cross, and for this they now crucify his doctrine. The least that can be asked of those who pass judgment upon any doctrine is that they shall judge of it with the same understanding as that with which it was propounded. Jesus understood his doctrine not as a vague and distant ideal impossible of attainment, not as a collection of fantastic and poetical reveries with which to charm the simple inhabitants on the shores of Galilee. To him, his doctrine was a doctrine of action, of acts which should become the salvation of mankind. This he showed in his manner of applying his doctrine. The crucified one who cried out in agony of spirit and died for his doctrine was not a dreamer. He was a man of action. They are not dreamers who have died and still die for his doctrine. No, that doctrine is not a chimera. All doctrine that reveals the truth is chimerical to the blind. We may say, as many people do say, I was of the number, that the doctrine of Jesus is chimerical because it is contrary to human nature. It is against nature, we say, to turn the other cheek when we have been struck, to give all that we possess, to toil not for ourselves, but for others. It is natural, we say, for a man to defend his person, his family, his property. That is to say, it is the nature of man to struggle for existence. A learned person has proved scientifically that the most sacred duty of man is to defend his rights, that is, to fight. But the moment we detach ourselves from the idea that the existing organization established by man is the best, is sacred, the moment we do this, the objection that the doctrine of Jesus is contrary to human nature turns immediately upon him who makes it. No one will deny that not only to kill or torture a man, but to torture a dog, to kill a fowl or a calf, is to inflict suffering reproved by human nature. I have known of farmers who had ceased to eat meat solely because it had fallen to their lot to slaughter animals. And yet our existence is so organized that every personal enjoyment is purchased at the price of human suffering contrary to human nature. We have only to examine closely the complicated mechanism of our institutions that are based upon coercion to realize that coercion and violence are contrary to human nature. The judge who is condemned according to the code is not willing to hang the criminal with his own hands. No clerk would tear a villager from his weeping family and cast him into prison. The general or the soldier, unless he be hardened by discipline and service, will not undertake to slay 100 Turks or Germans or destroy a village, would not, if he could help it, kill a single man. Yet all these things are done thanks to the administrative machinery which divides responsibility for misdeeds in such a way that no one feels them to be contrary to nature. Some make the laws, others execute them. Some train men by discipline to automatic obedience, and these last, in their turn, become the instruments of coercion and slay their kind without knowing why or to what end. But let a man disentangle himself for a moment from this complicated network, and he will readily see that coercion is contrary to his nature. Let us abstain from affirming that organized violence, of which we make use to our own profit, is a divine, immutable law, and we shall see clearly which is most in harmony with human nature, the doctrine of violence or the doctrine of Jesus. What is the law of nature? Is it to know that my security and that of my family, all my amusements and pleasures, are purchased at the expense of misery, deprivation, and suffering to thousands of human beings, by the terror of the gallows, by the misfortune of thousands stifling within prison walls, by the fear inspired by millions of soldiers and guardians of civilization, torn from their homes and besotted by discipline, to protect our pleasures with loaded revolvers against the possible interference of the famishing? Is it to purchase every fragment of bread that I put in my mouth and the mouths of my children by the numberless privations that are necessary to procure my abundance? Or is it to be certain that my piece of bread only belongs to me when I know that everyone else has a share and that no one starves while I eat? It is only necessary to understand that, thanks to our social organization, each one of our pleasures, every minute of our cherished tranquility, is obtained by the sufferings and privations of thousands of our fellows. It is only necessary to understand this, to know what is conformable to human nature, not to our animal nature alone, but the animal and spiritual nature which constitutes man. When we once understand the doctrine of Jesus in all its bearings, with all its consequences, we shall be convinced that his doctrine is not contrary to human nature, but that its sole object is to supplant the chimerical law of the struggle against evil by violence, itself the law contrary to human nature and productive of so many evils. Do you say that the doctrine of Jesus, resist not evil, is vain? What then are we to think of the lives of those who are not filled with love and compassion for their kind, of those who make ready for their fellow men punishment at the stake, by the knout, the wheel, the rack, chains, compulsory labour, the gibbet, dungeons, prisons for women and children, the hecatombs of war, or bring about periodical revolutions, of those who carry these horrors into execution, of those who benefit by these calamities or prepare reprisals? Are not such lives vain? We need only understand the doctrine of Jesus to be convinced that existence, not the reasonable existence which gives happiness to humanity, but the existence men have organized to their own hurt, that such an existence is a vanity, the most savage and horrible of vanities, a veritable delirium of folly, to which, once reclaimed, we do not again return. God descended to earth, became incarnate to redeem Adam's sin, and, so we were taught to believe, said many mysterious and mystical things which are difficult to understand, which it is not possible to understand except by the aid of faith and grace. And suddenly the words of God are found to be simple, clear, and reasonable. God said, "Do no evil, and evil will cease to exist." Was the revelation from God really so simple? Nothing but that. It would seem that everyone might understand it. It is so simple. The prophet Elijah, a fugitive from men, took refuge in a cave and was told that God would appear to him. There came a great wind that devastated the forest. Elijah thought that the Lord had come, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came the thunder and the lightning, but God was not there. Then came the earthquake. The earth belched forth fire, the rocks were shattered, the mountain was rent to its foundations. Elijah looked for the Lord, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then, in the calm that followed, a gentle breeze came to the prophet, bearing the freshness of the fields, and Elijah knew that God was there. It is a magnificent illustration of the words, "Resist not evil." They are very simple, these words, but they are, nevertheless, the expression of a law divine and human. If there has been in history a progressive movement for the suppression of evil, it is due to the men who understood the doctrine of Jesus, who endured evil and resisted not evil by violence. The advance of humanity towards righteousness is due not to the tyrants, but to the martyrs. As fire cannot extinguish fire, so evil cannot suppress evil. Good alone, confronting evil and resisting its contagion, can overcome evil. And in the inner world of the human soul, the law is as absolute as it was for the hearers by Galilee, more absolute, more clear, more immutable. Men may turn aside from it, they may hide its truth from others, but the progress of humanity towards righteousness can only be attained in this way. Every step must be guided by the command, "Resist not evil." A disciple of Jesus may say now, with greater assurance than they of Galilee, in spite of misfortunes and threats, and yet it is not violence, but good, that overcomes evil. If the progress is slow, it is because the doctrine of Jesus, which, through its clearness, simplicity, and wisdom, appeals so inevitably to human nature, because the doctrine of Jesus has been cunningly concealed from the majority of mankind under an entirely different doctrine falsely called by his name. The true meaning of the doctrine of Jesus was revealed to me. Everything confirmed its truth. But for a long time, I could not accustom myself to the strange fact that after the 18 centuries during which the law of Jesus had been professed by millions of human beings, after the 18 centuries during which thousands of men had consecrated their lives to the study of this law, I had discovered it for myself anew. But strange as it seemed, so it was. Jesus' law, "Resist not evil," was to me wholly new, something of which I had never had any conception before. I asked myself how this could be. I must certainly have had a false idea of the doctrine of Jesus to cause such a misunderstanding, and a false idea of it I unquestionably had. When I began to read the Gospel, I was not in the condition of one who, having heard nothing of the doctrine of Jesus, becomes acquainted with it for the first time. On the contrary, I had a preconceived theory as to the manner in which I ought to understand it. Jesus did not appeal to me as a prophet revealing the divine law, but as one who continued and amplified the absolute divine law which I already knew. For I had very definite and complex notions about God, the creator of the world and of man, and about the commandments of God given to men through the instrumentality of Moses. When I came to the words, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil," the words, "an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth," expressed the law given by God to Moses. The words, "But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil," expressed the new law, which was a negation of the first. If I had seen Jesus' words simply in their true sense, and not as a part of the theological theory that I had imbibed at my mother's breast, I should have understood immediately that Jesus abrogated the old law and substituted for it a new law. But I had been taught that Jesus did not abrogate the law of Moses, that on the contrary, he confirmed it to the slightest iota, and that he made it more complete. Verses 17 to 20 of the 5th chapter of Matthew always impressed me when I read the Gospel by their obscurity, and they plunged me into doubt. I knew the Old Testament, particularly the last books of Moses, very thoroughly, and recalling certain passages in which minute doctrines, often absurd and even cruel in their purport, are preceded by the words, "And the Lord said unto Moses," it seemed to me very singular that Jesus should confirm all these injunctions. I could not understand why he did so, but I allowed the question to pass without solution and accepted with confidence the explanations inculcated in my infancy, that the two laws were equally inspired by the Holy Spirit, that they were in perfect accord, and that Jesus confirmed the law of Moses while completing and amplifying it. I did not concern myself with accounting for the process of this amplification, with the solution of the contradictions apparent throughout the whole Gospel in verses 17 to 20 of the 5th chapter, in the words, "But I say unto you." Now that I understood the clear and simple meaning of the doctrine of Jesus, I saw clearly that the two laws are directly opposed to one another, that they can never be harmonized, that instead of supplementing one by the other, we must inevitably choose between the two, and that the received explanation of the verses, Matthew 17:20, which had impressed me by their obscurity, must be incorrect. When I now came to read once more the verses that had before impressed me as obscure, I was astonished at the clear and simple meaning which was suddenly revealed to me. This meaning was revealed not by any combination and transposition, but solely by rejecting the factitious explanations with which the words had been encumbered. According to Matthew, Jesus said, v. 17:18, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets, the doctrine of the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." And in verse 20 he added, "For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. I am not come," Jesus said, "to destroy the eternal law of whose fulfillment your books of prophecy foretell. I am come to teach you the fulfillment of the eternal law, not of the law that your scribes and Pharisees call the divine law, but of that eternal law which is more immutable than the earth and the heavens." I have expressed the idea in other words in order to detach the thoughts of my readers from the traditional false interpretation. If this false interpretation had never existed, the idea expressed in the verses could not be rendered in a better or more definite manner. The view that Jesus did not abrogate the old law arises from the arbitrary conclusion that law in this passage signifies the written law instead of the law eternal, the reference to the iota, jot, and tittle, perhaps furnishing the grounds for such an opinion. But if Jesus had been speaking of the written law, he would have used the expression the law and the prophets, which he always employed in speaking of the written law. Here, however, he uses a different expression, the law or the prophets. If Jesus had meant the written law, he would have used the expression, the law and the prophets, in the verses that follow and that continue the thought. But he says briefly, the law. Moreover, according to Luke, Jesus made use of the same phraseology, and the context renders the meaning inevitable. According to Luke, Jesus said to the Pharisees, who assumed the justice of their written law, "Ye are they which justify yourselves before men. But God knoweth your hearts, for that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God." The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. And it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail. The Gospel of Luke. In the words, the law and the prophets were until John, Jesus abrogated the written law. In the words, and it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail, Jesus confirmed the law eternal. In the first passage cited, he said, the law and the prophets, that is, the written law. In the second, he said, the law, simply, therefore, the law eternal. It is clear, then, that the eternal law is opposed to the written law, exactly as in the context of Matthew, where the eternal law is defined by the phrase, the law, or the prophets. The history of the variants of the text of these verses is quite worthy of notice. The majority of texts have simply the law, without the addition, and the prophets, thus avoiding a false interpretation in the sense of the written law. In other texts, notably that of Tischendorf and in the canonical versions, we find the word prophets used, not with the conjunction and, but with the conjunction or, the law or the prophets, which also excludes any question of the written law and indicates, as the proper signification, the law eternal. In several other versions, not countenanced by the Church, we find the word prophets used with the conjunction and, not with or. And in these versions, every repetition of the words the law is followed by the phrase and the prophets, which would indicate that Jesus spoke only of the written law. The history of the commentaries on the passage in question coincides with that of the variants. The only clear meaning is that authorized by Luke, that Jesus spoke of the eternal law. But among the copyists of the Gospel were some who desired that the written law of Moses should continue to be regarded as obligatory. They therefore added to the words the law, the phrase, and the prophets, and thereby changed the interpretation of the text. Other Christians, not recognizing to the same degree the authority of the books of Moses, suppressed the added phrase and replaced the particle kai and with e or. And with this substitution, the passage was admitted to the canon. Nevertheless, in spite of the unequivocal clearness of the text as thus written, the commentators perpetuated the interpretation supported by the phrase which had been rejected in the canon. The passage evoked innumerable comments which stray from the true signification in proportion to the lack, on the part of the commentators, of fidelity to the simple and obvious meaning of Jesus' doctrine. Most of them recognize the reading rejected by the canonical text. To be absolutely convinced that Jesus spoke only of the eternal law, we need only examine the true meaning of the word which has given rise to so many false interpretations. The word law, in Greek nomos, in Hebrew chraut, Torah, has in all languages two principal meanings. One, law in the abstract sense, independent of formulae. The other, the written statutes which men generally recognize as law. In the Greek of Paul's epistles, the distinction is indicated by the use of the article. Without the article, Paul uses nomos the most frequently in the sense of the divine eternal law. By the ancient Hebrews, as in books of Isaiah and the other prophets, haraut, Torah, is always used in the sense of an eternal revelation, a divine intuition. It was not till the time of Esdras, and later in the Talmud, that Torah was used in the same sense in which we use the word Bible, with this difference that while we have words to distinguish between the Bible and the divine law, the Jews employed the same word to express both meanings. And so Jesus sometimes speaks of law as the divine law of Isaiah and the other prophets, in which case he confirms it, and sometimes in the sense of the written law of the Pentateuch, in which case he rejects it. To distinguish the difference, he always, in speaking of the written law, adds, and the prophets, or prefixes the word your law. When he says, therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets, the Gospel of Matthew. He speaks of the written law. The entire written law, he says, may be reduced to this expression of the eternal law, and by these words he abrogated the eternal law. When he says, the law and the prophets were until John, the Gospel of Luke, he speaks of the written law and abrogates it. When he says, did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you keepeth the law, the Gospel of John, it is also written in your law, John, that the word might be fulfilled that is written in their law, the Gospel of John. He speaks of the written law, the law whose authority he denied, the law that condemned him to death. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die, the Gospel of John. It is plain that this Jewish law, which authorized condemnation to death, was not the law of Jesus. But when Jesus says, I am not come to destroy the law, but to teach you the fulfillment of the law, for nothing of this law shall be changed, but all shall be fulfilled, then he speaks, not of the written law, but of the divine and eternal law. Admit that all this is merely formal proof. Admit that I have carefully combined contexts and variants and excluded everything contrary to my theory. Admit that the commentators of the Church are clear and convincing that in fact Jesus did not abrogate the law of Moses, but upheld it. Admit this. Then the question is, what were the teachings of Jesus? According to the Church, he taught that he was the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, and that he came into the world to atone by his death for Adam's sin. Those, however, who have read the Gospels know that Jesus taught nothing of the sort, or at least spoke but very vaguely on these topics. The passages in which Jesus affirms that he is the second person of the Trinity and that he was to atone for the sins of humanity form a very inconsiderable and very obscure portion of the Gospels. In what, then, does the rest of Jesus' doctrine consist? It is impossible to deny, for all Christians have recognized the fact that the doctrine of Jesus aims summarily to regulate the lives of men, to teach them how they ought to live with regard to one another. But to realize that Jesus taught men a new way of life, we must have some idea of the condition of the people to whom his teachings were addressed. When we examine into the social development of the Russians, the English, the Chinese, the Indians, or even the races of insular savages, we find that each people invariably has certain practical rules or laws which govern its existence. Consequently, if anyone would inculcate a new law, he must at the same time abolish the old. In any race or nation, this would be inevitable. Laws that we are accustomed to regard as almost sacred would assuredly be abrogated. With us, perhaps, it might happen that a reformer who taught a new law would abolish only our civil laws, the official code, our administrative customs, without touching what we consider as our divine laws, although it is difficult to believe that such could be the case. But with the Jewish people, who had but one law, and that recognized as divine, a law which enveloped life to its minutest details, what could a reformer accomplish if he declared in advance that the existing law was inviolable? Admit that this argument is not conclusive, and try to interpret the words of Jesus as an affirmation of the entire Mosaic law. In that case, who were the Pharisees, the scribes, the doctors of the law, denounced by Jesus during the whole of his ministry? Who were they that rejected the doctrine of Jesus, and their high priests at their head crucified him? If Jesus approved the law of Moses, where were the faithful followers of that law who practiced it sincerely and must thereby have obtained Jesus' approval? Is it possible that there was not one such? The Pharisees, we are told, constituted a sect. Where then were the righteous? In the Gospel of John, the enemies of Jesus are spoken of directly as the Jews. They are opposed to the doctrine of Jesus. They are hostile because they are Jews. But it is not only the Pharisees and the Sadducees who figure in the Gospels as the enemies of Jesus. We also find mention of the doctors of the law, the guardians of the law of Moses, the scribes, the interpreters of the law, the ancients, those who are always considered as representatives of the people's wisdom. Jesus said, "I am not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance, to change their way of life, metanoia." But where were the righteous? Was Nicodemus the only one? He is represented as a good but misguided man. We are so habituated to the singular opinion that Jesus was crucified by the Pharisees and a number of Jewish shopkeepers that we never think to ask, where were the true Jews, the good Jews, the Jews that practiced the law? When we have once propounded this query, everything becomes perfectly clear. Jesus, whether he was God or man, brought his doctrine to a people possessing rules called the divine law, governing their whole existence. How could Jesus avoid denouncing that law? Every prophet, every founder of a religion inevitably meets in revealing the divine law to men with institutions which are regarded as upheld by the laws of God. He cannot, therefore, avoid a double use of the word law, which expresses what his hearers wrongfully consider the law of God, your law, and the law he has come to proclaim, the true law, the divine and eternal law. A reformer not only cannot avoid the use of the word in this manner, often he does not wish to avoid it, but purposely confounds the two ideas, thus indicating that, in the law confessed by those whom he would convert, there are still some eternal truths. Every reformer takes these truths, so well known to his hearers, as the basis of his teaching. This is precisely what Jesus did in addressing the Jews, by whom the two laws were vaguely grouped together as Torah. Jesus recognized that the Mosaic law, and still more the prophetical books, especially the writings of Isaiah, whose words he constantly quotes, Jesus recognized that these contain divine and eternal truths in harmony with the eternal law, and these he takes as the basis of his own doctrine. This method was many times referred to by Jesus. Thus he said, "What is written in the law? How readest thou?" Luke Acts 26. That is, one may find eternal truth in the law if one reads it aright. And more than once he affirms that the commandments of the Mosaic law, to love the Lord and one's neighbor, are also commandments of the eternal law. At the conclusion of the parables by which Jesus explained the meaning of his doctrine to his disciples, he pronounced words that have a bearing upon all that precedes. Therefore, every scribe which is instructed unto the kingdom of heaven, the truth, is like unto a man that is a householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure, without distinction, things new and old. The Gospel of Matthew. The Church understands these words as they were understood by Irenaeus, but at the same time, in defiance of the true signification, it arbitrarily attributes to them the meaning that everything old is sacred. The manifest meaning is this: he who seeks for the good takes not only the new, but also the old, and because a thing is old, he does not therefore reject it. By these words, Jesus meant that he did not deny what was eternal in the old law. But when they spoke to him of the whole law, or of the formalities exacted by the old law, his reply was that new wine should not be put into old bottles. Jesus could not affirm the whole law, neither could he deny the entire teachings of the law and the prophets, the law which says, love thy neighbor as thyself, the prophets whose words often serve to express his own thoughts. And yet, in place of this clear and simple explanation of Jesus' words, we are offered a vague interpretation which introduces needless contradictions, which reduces the doctrine of Jesus to nothingness, and which re-establishes the doctrine of Moses in all its savage cruelty. Commentators of the Church, particularly those who have written since the 5th century, tell us that Jesus did not abolish the written law, that on the contrary, he affirmed it. But in what way? How is it possible that the law of Jesus should harmonize with the law of Moses? To these inquiries we get no response. The commentators all make use of a verbal juggle to the effect that Jesus fulfilled the law of Moses and that the sayings of the prophets were fulfilled in his person, that Jesus fulfilled the law as our mediator by our faith in him. And the essential question for every believer, how to harmonize two conflicting laws, each designed to regulate the lives of men, is left without the slightest attempt at explanation. Thus, the contradiction between the verse where it is said that Jesus did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law, and Jesus is saying, Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye. But I say unto you, the contradiction between the doctrine of Jesus and the very spirit of the Mosaic doctrine is left without any mitigation. Let those who are interested in the question look through the church commentaries touching this passage from the time of Chrysostom to our day. After a perusal of the voluminous explanations offered, they will be convinced not only of the complete absence of any solution for the contradiction, but of the presence of a new, factitious contradiction arising in its place. Let us see what Chrysostom says in reply to those who reject the law of Moses. He made this law, not that we might strike out one another's eyes, but that fear of suffering by others might restrain us from doing any such thing to them. As therefore he threatened the Ninevites with overthrow, not that he might destroy them, for had that been his will, he ought to have been silent, but that he might by fear make them better, and so quiet his wrath. So also hath he appointed a punishment for those who wantonly assail the eyes of others, that if good principle dispose them not to refrain from such cruelty, fear may restrain them from injuring their neighbour's sight. And if this be cruelty, it is cruelty also for the murderer to be restrained, and the adulterer checked. But these are the sayings of senseless men, and of those that are mad to the extreme of madness. For I, so far from saying that this comes of cruelty, should say that the contrary to this would be unlawful, according to men's reckoning. And whereas thou sayest, because he commanded to pluck out an eye for an eye, therefore he is cruel, I say that if he had not given this commandment, then he would have seemed, in the judgment of most men, to be that which thou sayest he is. Chrysostom clearly recognized the law, an eye for an eye, as divine, and the contrary of that law, that is, the doctrine of Jesus, resist not evil, as an iniquity. For let us suppose, says Chrysostom further, for let us suppose that this law had been altogether done away, and that no one feared the punishment ensuing thereupon, but that license had been given to all the wicked to follow their own dispositions in all security to adulterers and to murderers, to perjured persons and to parricides. Would not all things have been turned upside down? Would not cities, marketplaces and houses, sea and land, and the whole world have been filled with unnumbered pollutions and murders? Everyone sees it. For if, when there are laws and fear and threatening, our evil dispositions are hardly checked, were even this security taken away, what is there to prevent men's choosing vice? And what degree of mischief would not then come revelling upon the whole of human life? The rather, since cruelty lies not only in allowing the bad to do what they will, but in another thing too quite as much, to overlook and leave uncared for him who hath done no wrong, but who is without cause or reason suffering ill. For tell me, were any one to gather together wicked men from all quarters, and arm them with swords, and bid them go about the whole city, and massacre all that came in their way, Could there be anything more like a wild beast than he? And what if some others should bind and confine with the utmost strictness those whom that man had armed, and should snatch from those lawless hands them who were on the point of being butchered? Could anything be greater humanity than this? Chrysostom does not say what would be the estimate of these others in the opinion of the wicked. And what if these others were themselves wicked and cast the innocent into prison? Chrysostom continues, "Now then, I bid thee transfer these examples to the law likewise. For he that commands to pluck out an eye for an eye hath laid the fear as a kind of strong chain upon the souls of the bad, and so resembles him who detains those assassins in prison, whereas he who appoints no punishment for them doth all but arm them by such security, and acts the part of that other who was putting the swords in their hands and letting them loose over the whole city." Homilies on the Gospel of St. Matthew. If Chrysostom had understood the law of Jesus, he would have said, "Who is it that strikes out another's eyes? Who is it that casts men into prison?" If God, who made the law, does this, then there is no contradiction, but it is men who carry out the decrees, and the Son of God has said to men that they must abstain from violence. God commanded to strike out, and the Son of God commanded not to strike out. We must accept one commandment or the other, and Chrysostom, like all the rest of the Church, accepted the commandment of Moses and denied that of the Christ, whose doctrine he nevertheless claims to believe. Jesus abolished the Mosaic law and gave his own law in its place. To one who really believes in Jesus, there is not the slightest contradiction. Such an one will pay no attention to the law of Moses, but will practice the law of Jesus, which he believes. To one who believes in the law of Moses, there is no contradiction. The Jews looked upon the words of Jesus as foolishness and believed in the law of Moses. The contradiction is only for those who would follow the law of Moses under the cover of the law of Jesus, for those whom Jesus denounced as hypocrites, as a generation of vipers. Instead of recognizing as divine truth the one or the other of the two laws, the law of Moses or that of Jesus, we recognize the divine quality of both. But when the question comes with regard to the acts of everyday life, we reject the law of Jesus and follow that of Moses. And this false interpretation, when we realize its importance, reveals the source of that terrible drama which records the struggle between evil and good, between darkness and light. To the Jewish people, trained to the innumerable formal regulations instituted by the Levites in the rubric of divine laws, each preceded by the words, "And the Lord said unto Moses." To the Jewish people, Jesus appeared. He found everything, to the minutest detail, prescribed by rule. Not only the relation of man with God, but his sacrifices, his feasts, his fasts, his social, civil, and family duties, the details of personal habits, circumcision, the purification of the body, of domestic utensils, of clothing. All these regulated by laws recognized as commandments of God, and therefore as divine. Excluding the question of Jesus' divine mission, what could any prophet or reformer do who wished to establish his own doctrines among a people so enveloped in formalism? What but abolish the law by which all these details were regulated? Jesus selected from what men considered as the law of God the portions which were really divine. He took what served his purpose, rejected the rest, and upon this foundation established the eternal law. It was not necessary to abolish all, but inevitable to abrogate much that was looked upon as obligatory. This Jesus did, and was accused of destroying the divine law. For this he was condemned and put to death. But his doctrine was cherished by his disciples, traversed the centuries, and is transmitted to other peoples. Under these conditions, it is again hidden beneath heterogeneous dogmas, obscure comments, and factitious explanations. Pitiable human sophisms replace the divine revelation. For the formula, "And the Lord said unto Moses," we substitute, "Thus saith the Holy Spirit." And again, formalism hides the truth. Most astounding of all, the doctrine of Jesus is amalgamated with the written law, whose authority he was forced to deny. This Torah, this written law, is declared to have been inspired by the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth. And thus, Jesus is taken in the snare of his own revelation. His doctrine is reduced to nothingness. This is why, after 1800 years, it so singularly happened that I discovered the meaning of the doctrine of Jesus as some new thing. But no, I did not discover it. I did simply what all must do who seek after God and his law. I sought for the eternal law amid the incongruous elements that men call by that name.